get started. Yesterday or Friday, I was reading an article from the New York Times. I have a subscription for the New York Times, and I looked at it, and it caught my eye, and it rang bells in my head. And the article said that there is a movement in the White House currently, right now, to go after those who persecuted the Christians under the Biden administration. Now, just think about that.
Right.
Why does it ring a bell? Because
we're 500 years past that. Yeah.
Mary, you're right. 500 years ago, those were the issues that our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors were fighting. It is why they moved from here to there to everywhere, because of that. And in a country, and I'm just political now, in a country that believes in separation of church and state, that is scary. And if somebody, Supreme Court or some other court, or the voters don't step in the future, we could be in real trouble. Just imagine that they're going to prosecute someone who discriminated against Christians. That's the statement what that was during the Biden administration. Of course, it's political, but still, that will ring bells. That will bring the supporters from the Christian world, particularly those who are inclined to it. That will bring them, to that side of the political spectrum, etc. I just wanted to bring that to you because it scared me when I read it. So, okay, as I looked back at my notes, let me set this up. Okay, you got it now. As I looked at my notes from last time, I realized that I had left a couple of issues that I wanted to tell you about. And I mentioned one, I think, but let's go back now and talk a little bit about the Mennonites who were left in the USSR. I'll go back and quickly just talk about the sequence. In 1917, excuse me, the German army invaded Ukraine. Then it was part of Russia, so they called it South Russia, but it was Ukraine. And so the German army showed up, and then the Russian government got the leadership of the Mennonite colonies, Kortitsa and Malachna and others, together and said, look, we know that you are German supporters. Well, how do you know that? No, we're Dutch. We're not German, we're Dutch. Well, he said, we have pictures of Mennonite people standing in the train station at Zaporozhye, and when the German army came in on the train and disembarked, they were singing Deutschland über alles, which was the national anthem of Germany. And we know that you are German fifth columnists. They're very interesting. Abraham Friesen, who was here a year ago, has written a series of articles about that particular issue. How did the leadership of the Mennonite colonies convince people that they were Dutch and not German? So anyhow, so after that, after World War I, then you had the Communist Revolution at the same time. And then at that point, then a typhoid epidemic hit southern Russia. And Mennonites were not only starving from lack of food, but they were also, they were dying of typhoid. And so it became a very tough issue. And thankfully, for many of them, Canada opened its borders to migration, and the Russians gave them exit visas, and thousands of Mennonites immigrated basically to Canada and some other parts of the world. Again, in World War II, the German army invaded Ukraine. And the same thing happened. And the Russians were, you know, what are they going to do with these Mennonites? They're Germans. It is said that 35,000 Mennonites immigrated to the West when the German army retreated. So after the Russian army pushed the German army out, 35,000 Mennonites immigrated with them. They basically, the German army took them with them. Can you imagine that mass of people? And when they got to the West, this is World War II now, 2/3 of them were repatriated back into the USSR. And essentially were pushed into Siberia, to what's called the stands, Uzbekistan, Kurdistan, those areas. 12,000 of those who were left were shipped to Paraguay and to Canada. Now I want to tell you a story. I did my MCC 1W service in Akron. And as a result, I was the accountant in the business office. I had accounting training. And we were fortunate at that point that Peter and Elfrida Dick came back to Akron and came to church with us at the Akron Methodist Church. If you have heard that name, anybody have heard that name? Peter and Elfrida Dick, who were they? He is the brother to Cornelius, to C.K. And who wrote one of the good Mennonite history books. Anyhow, they came back and they told us the story one night. We were in a small group with Peter and Elfrida. And they said, we haven't told this story for a while, but here it is. And I sat, just couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were MCC staff members in 1945 when this group of people were sent into, were being repatriated back into Soviet Union. Peter and Elfrida were in charge of the group that were rounding up the DPs, as they call them, displaced persons, in Europe particularly. And they got wind of a large number of Mennonites who were caught in the American zone in Berlin. Now, if you know something of the geography and the history of that period, you will know that the Soviets controlled the access point to Berlin from Holland. So if you're going to get someone from Berlin to Holland, where would you go? Right through the Soviet zone. So Peter Dick went to the American general who was in charge of the US Army in West Berlin and told him the story. And he said, don't worry, we'll help. So they got them all up. They got a train with boxcars, regular boxcars. And I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of Mennonites were put into that train. And the train pulled out of Berlin, the American zone, into the Soviet zone. And then the praying began. Because they knew that if a baby cried and the Russian army heard it, that was curtains for that group. The train slowly pulled through the Soviet zone. Within a half a mile of the Dutch border, it stopped. It was surrounded by the Russian army. and nobody knew what was happening. But Peter said, one thing we knew, they were praying. Because again, if there was any noise coming from that train, the Russians would know the game is up. All of a sudden, the Russian officer gave the signal and the train pulled out into the Dutch zone and they were free. Can you imagine that story? I was, 21, 22 years old. And it was just an amazing story to me. Those Russian Mennonites in that train were actually put onto a ship, Holland America line ship, free of charge. The Holland American line gave them free tickets and they shipped them to Paraguay. So that group of people that were in that train ended up living in the Chaco area of Paraguay. Today, it is extremely wealthy. They know what they're doing. They said, I saw a figure that said that the Mennonites produce 60% of the dairy products for the country of Paraguay. So that's one story. Those who were taken into Siberia essentially disappeared. And they're spread all over Russia. And that's why one of the historians said that's the black hole of Mennonite historical studies. Nobody knows the stories of those Mennonites in Russia. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what comes out. They're putting out a plea in Canada, particularly where these people came from, to tell the story, write their stories, and they'll collect them and so forth. It is really an interesting. Some years ago, you may remember, the Historical Society had an annual meeting at the Albany Mennonite Church, and the speaker was a young, about a 40-year-old woman from British Columbia, who told the story of her mother and her 3 children. She was the oldest of the 3 children. They were living in Ukraine, and the war started, and their father was drafted into the Russian army. And they got word, in fact, that he had been killed in action. And she decided that this was time to leave, and she packed up the 3 children and somehow made it out of Ukraine into Europe. She was in Austria, in fact. And they were contacted by Arthur Voth, V-O-T-H, who, when I knew him, was a travel agent in Akron. But he had been a paxman, and he contacted that family. They were sent to Canada. And that was a compelling story if you go back to the old issues of our newsletter for the society, you could actually see the story. Okay, I just wanted to update you what happened in World War II. One other thing. From the very beginning, if you think about it now, from the very beginning, the issue with the Mennonites in many areas where they were, in Europe particularly, the issue of peace and non-resistance came to the front. And that's one of the reasons why they were persecuted and executed and whatnot, because they refused to take arms. We have I don't know if you've met him. His name is Jay Beeman. Jay lives in Portland near Lewis and Clark University. Comes out of the Pentecostal. He's now a Mennonite. He's a member of the Portland Mennonite Church. He has published a set of volumes of the conscientious objectors of World War I. So I'm going to tell you very quickly the story of the conscientious objector. In World War I, there was no draft. There was no conscientious objector status. Everybody who was of age was drafted into the US Army or wherever. And so many young men of Mennonite faith, Mennonites, and what Jay is finding is also people like the Pentecostals were strongly non-resistant during World War I era. And they were, I'll take a personal story. My dad's oldest brother, Jacob Barkman, was drafted and was sent to Fort Riley, Kansas, which was about 60 miles, maybe 50 from Hillsboro, where I grew up, or where Uncle Jake grew up. He was drafted into the Army with other Mennonite young men from the central states and sent to Fort Riley for basic training. Well, Uncle Jake and a group of others refused to take orders because they said they were not in the Army. And instead of marching on the parade ground, they sat down in the middle of the parade ground and sang hymns. Of course, they were court-martialed. Uncle Jake was sentenced to 28 years at Leavenworth Federal Prison. 28 years. They moved him then, put him in prison at Fort Leavenworth. 2 weeks after he got there, they sent him home. And the reason I read the reason was the Army finally said, look, were we gonna feed this guy for 28 years? For what? And so they just quietly released him and went home. Unfortunately, that is not what happened to others. There were 2 Hutterite boys that were sent to Alcatraz in the San Francisco Bay and were partially treated by the guards at Alcatraz. They were sent then from there to Leavenworth, where they
No sound.
Can you write it? They can't see you, can they? Is your picture up there? Your picture's not up there, they can't see you.
It's there.
Do you know how to write up the
From
side?
draft board, Marion County, Kansas. You're required to register. How do you plead? That's kind of what it was. I didn't know what to do, so I talked to a church friend at my home church named Dwight Weeby, who was another one of those paxmen that was in Europe during 1945. And he worked for the Mennonite Brother Mission Board. I said, Dwight, here's my letter. How do I answer this question? Why am I asking for 1W status? And he said, look, the thing you don't want to do is tell them the Bible tells me you shouldn't kill. He said, they know that. He said, the best way to tell them is to say, I was brought up in the Mennonite church and I was taught peace and non-resistance from my youngest days. And that's why I'm pleading for 1W status. Sent it over to the draft board. And I didn't even have to go testify. They just sent me a card, said 1W. So by that time, by Vietnam days, of course, now there is no draft. At least I don't think there is.
There's no draft, but sitting on my desk at home are two letters, one to Paul, one to Simon,
Mhm,
and they just sit there.
mhm.
And every couple of years, because now Simon's 21,
Yeah.
I'll get another one.
Mhm.
So, and they just sit on the desk and I don't.
Yeah.
I've talked with, we don't know what to do with them, so they just sit on the desk
Oh.
in the kitchen. There are letters that they need to,
From who?
from the US government. I can bring them next week.
But what do they say?
I don't know, we send them. I know that they're for them to somehow fill out their.
They're supposed to register.
Yeah, it's their registration thing.
Yeah.
And
They
the
don't have
boys
to
know they're there,
declare,
and I just-
they don't have to declare what they want.
Yeah.
but they- yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was drafted, I wasn't so lucky, I got number 68, so I talked to my pastor about, David Mann. And he contacted the draft board, and I didn't have anything to do with it, they,
Mhm.
like 3 or 4 weeks later, I got a notice in the mail, that 1W. So I still had to go take a physical.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting, as I looked at this and studied it, they slowly learned how to deal with these people, and there aren't that many conscientious objectors in contrast to the number of people who aren't. I was told that the Mennonite Brethren boys during the Vietnam War, 60% had registered as full Army, had not asked for 1W status. 60% of Mennonite Brethren boys. That shows me how far that particular group of churches have taught their people. So,
Even in Albany, I know at least 2 or 3 people that were drafted and
mhm.
they also got asked to go to church too.
But one of the 3 members of the draft board in Marion County was in fact an ex-Mennonite who had joined the Army. So he certainly knew. Okay, let's get started okay, one more thing. We have 2 lessons left, 2 Sundays yet. After today, so 2 more. The next one, we're going to talk about the Anabaptist Mennonite churches worldwide. And I'm gonna give you some statistics. You're gonna be surprised. That will be one. The last one is gonna be a free-for-all. I'm gonna go back to the Schleitheim confession. And then we're gonna have a discussion among ourselves in this classroom as to where are we today. I'm gonna wrap this thing up and I'm gonna ask you, where are we in contrast to those Anabaptists who died 500 years ago? So think about that, because that'll be our last, that will be 7 Sundays, right, Jana? That's what we agreed to. So, now, today is, see if okay. We're going to talk about the immigration of Mennonites, Anabaptists from Europe, particularly to the United States. And all of us in this room are part of that immigration, even if we don't have forefathers who were Anabaptist Mennonite. But this church is a result of that immigration that came from the very, very beginning of the American experience. There are references to Dutch Mennonites, Menists, Mennonites. That's what they were called at the very beginning, Mennonites. There are references to them being in Manhattan, New York City, in 1644. That's just about the earliest, maybe a little bit later than the first America, Vespucius and Columbus and all those guys. And they were seen, there are references on Long Island in 1657. So that far back, that's 100 years before the American Revolution. In 1663, Peter Cornelius Plockhoy, a Mennonite collegiant, its fancy word says he was involved in education, from Amsterdam, established a communitarian settlement of 41 persons, including Mennonites, at Horkill on the Delaware River. The colony was destroyed a year later by the British troops. So those are the earliest references to Anabaptist Mennonites. And in the case of New York particularly, they were Dutch. On October 6, 1683, 34 Mennonites and Quakers involved also from Crayfield, Germany, arrived in America after a 10.5-week journey and settled in Germantown, just north of Philadelphia. Others from the lower Rhine area joined them, so by 1705, the Philadelphia church totaled 200 members. A log meeting house was erected in 1708, was replaced by a stone building, which is still standing and in use. The Germantown Mennonite Church is the oldest Mennonite church in the United States. Very interesting. I don't recall if I've seen that church. I've been in the area, but it is. I have to tell you this little story. We had a Quaker come to speak to us about the way the Quakers do their thing, and there was a Quaker group in Philadelphia that had a problem. The problem was their meeting house was built on a piece of land, and they had some empty land, and there were 2 groups that wanted to use the empty land. One was the group that wanted to expand the child care playground, and the other one wanted to expand the cemetery. Can you imagine? Now, how do you peacefully resolve that one? The person who reported this attended that meeting that was left in a draw. And he said, he turned to me and he said, you know, there are going to have to be some good Quaker funerals here before this one gets settled. So the Mennonites and the Quakers, although they didn't come, the Quakers didn't come from them, but we're very much on their side. William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, he was granted that by the king in England, granted 18,000 acres of land to 6 men of this group on condition that they establish a colony. The groups that found their way to Pennsylvania included Dunkers. You ever heard of a Dunker? Yeah. Church of the Brethren, actually. They are now called the Church of the Brethren. And their college is Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. There were Moravians and there were the Schwenkfelders. We had 2 young paxmen in MCC with me from Souderton, Pennsylvania. And they didn't say Souderton, they said Souderton in the Pennsylvania Dutch. And they were Schwenkfelders. They were from the Schwenkfeld Church. Schwenkfeld himself was an Anabaptist leader in Europe at the very beginning of the movement. And so there were Schwenkfelders. These groups soon almost covered what is now Lancaster County and continued to branch out. Now, if you've been in Lancaster County, you know that that is Mennonite country. Yeah. Yeah, I lived there for 2 years. I loved it. It's beautiful country. And so that was for the Anabaptist movement, that was probably New York and Pennsylvania were the 2 points where they immigrated from Europe. Okay. So we're going to take an intermission, not an intermission, but we're going to look at a little bit the issue of the Civil War. By and large, the Mennonites were anti-slavery during the Civil War. The Quaker John Woolman told of a Mennonite who traveled a great distance to visit a friend, but when he saw that he owned slaves, he refused his hospitality and slept in the woods. That was the attitude of a lot of the Mennonites. They didn't have anything to do with slavery. The later Burkholder Confession of 1837, that's before the Civil War, stated that as all are free in Christ, they must take no part in slaveholding or in trafficking with them in any wide definition. So what happened to the Mennonites during Civil War? Have you any of you have ancestors who might have told stories about that time? Most of them, in fact, during that and earlier, the Revolutionary War, there were places where a lot of pressure were put on the Mennonites to join the Revolutionary Army or the Northern Army, and they could pay fees to be exempted, or they could hire someone to take their place. That happened also. But by and large, the pressure on the Anabaptist Mennonites during Civil War was not that as intense as it was later. Okay, now.
Was the fee a steep fee or a reasonable fee that they?
Yeah, it was reasonable. Yeah, it was.
Revolutionary War, it was Christian Smucker, who was in Lancaster at that time. He paid a lot. There's a
He
book
did.
about him.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, from these, now my next heading is Mennonites move westward. So out of Pennsylvania particularly, from these early beginnings until 1924, European Mennonites settled primarily in the United States in 1924. First among those were 4,000 Swiss and South German Mennonites and about 200 Amish. That was the first wave. They settled mostly in Pennsylvania. That's why you have strong Amish presence in Lancaster County, for instance, and farther even western Pennsylvania. The 7-Year War, which was 1756 to 63, between England and France ended further migration. And it was only renewed into the United States after the Napoleonic War ended in 1815. Then, during those wars in Europe, nobody left and nobody came here. And then 3,000 Amish Mennonites came from Alsace-Lorraine and South Germany to Pennsylvania. They settled there at first, but soon moved further west to Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and so forth.
My Oyer ancestors came from Alsace-Lorraine in about
Yeah.
1830. They came in through the port of New Orleans.
Yeah.
And they went up to Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah, see that, it's interesting, if you look at grandma, do you all know what grandma is? Okay, I'll quickly tell you the story. Young man from Dallas, Oregon, named Alan Peters, was given an assignment in his 3rd, 4th, 5th grade class to tell his family's story. So he went home to Grandpa Peters, and Grandpa Peters told him the story. And that so intrigued him that as he got older, he started accumulating names. So he told this story. He and his wife Jeannie were Tabor College students just ahead of us, so I knew Alan quite well. And he told me, he said, I bought 3x5 cards. And they said, I put a name on it, Ray Smucker. Okay, that would be his first record. And then he wrote parents. So he would write it on his card, who his parents were, who your children were, where you lived, the dates, birth, and so on and so forth. When I met him when I was in seminary, he took me into his office and he had a file, huge file, 330,000 cards. He had accumulated that much data. Now these, mind you, are only, the originals were only Mennonites from South Russia, because that was his family and that's where he started. So finally it got so big that friends in the Fresno area convinced him to go digital. And so they hired a group and they put everything on a database, and it's called Grandma. You can order it, just go to grandma.com, grandma.org. You can order it for $30. It now has 1,611,000 names in it.
That spell.
Grandma, Grandma. I keep up one for the society here, and I have personally my own, and it is fascinating. But what I like to look at when I see people, so I have Stan Oyer, okay? I look at your name, and I look at not just your birth date, though that's very important, but I look at, did you immigrate? And thousands of those entries for people are immigration, and you can see my family, my grandfather, his father, immigrated to New York on the SS City of Brooklyn. That's on in that database. So if you want information about anyone who is of Russian Mennonite background, that's the place to go. And I don't think there is anything equivalent to that in the Mennonite Church. I'm not seeing any kind of information. So let's continue. By the time of the Civil War in 1860, a group of 500 Mennonites and Amish Mennonites had come to Ohio, and Indiana directly from Switzerland. So after that Napoleonic War in 1815 ended, then the immigrations continued again. And you had all of these groups of various and sundry groups that came to the West. Okay. Part of this group that came to Lancaster and to New York went to Canada. Meanwhile, some Mennonites had also begun moving to Canada after the Revolutionary War of 1776. A group went to Ontario, where a town named Ebytown was founded. The guy was John Eby. What do you name a town? Ebytown. It's now called Kitchener. So if you know where Kitchener, Ontario is, that was the center of the first Amish immigration to Canada. Among those groups, then a number of Amish groups moved on to Canada. Now, the movement into central and western Canada is really not the Mennonites who immigrated from Europe to the United States. Mostly those who immigrated into Canada came from Ukraine and those kind of places. So you have sort of two wings. One is the American immigration of Mennonites, and then you have the other group, which are mostly South Russian, and they headed both to the United States and to mostly Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and points west. Okay. I want to see. Now, I'm going to talk about groups that formed after immigrants came to the United States, particularly. Then the first one that we mentioned is the largest of the group outside of the Mennonite Church. And that was known as the General Conference Mennonite Church. If you know your history, recent history, you know that the two conferences merged to form what is now MCUSA. Okay. The General Conference Mennonite Church was the first American Mennonite General Conference organization, and in 1955, the second largest body of America was organized 28 May 1890 at West Point, Iowa, by three small Mennonite congregations. So in Iowa, this is where it started. And by 1955, it had grown to 244 congregations, with a membership totaling 50,000, located in United States, Canada, and South America. Its headquarters was Newton, Kansas. And I worked in Newton for a year at Menno Travel Service, and right next door to me was the General Conference headquarters. So I got to know some of those people. My wife's church that she grew up in was General Conference. And so we have, our family is mixed between Mennonite Brethren and the General Conference. And that became in our area, that became somewhat controversial, because the Mennonite Brethren were considered more conservative, and the GCs, as we call them, were a little bit more liberal. And in fact, my wife went to Grace Bible Institute for 1 year. She promised her parents she would, but she wanted to study science, and so she didn't try to go to Bethel College, because that was GC, and her father wouldn't pay for it. So she came to Tabor College, and she met me. Now that's real history there. And so that church, that church spread all over. And it's hard to say what kind of, it was Mennonite, Anabaptist in background, but it was very large. So in 1999, the decision was made to merge the General Conference Mennonite Church with Mennonite Church Conference. It was to be named MCUSA. The merger was completed by January 31, 2002. I didn't realize that the MCUSA was that old until I started looking at the numbers.
What was the original reason they didn't join Mennonite Church? Why did GC start instead of just joining the other?
Say that again?
So when they formed the general conference, was there a rift of some sort, or why did they not just join Mennonite Church conference?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question. Except like, I'll try to answer it this way. My sister, my younger sister, is a Baptist, joined the Baptist church when she was married. And she has been in 4 or 5 Baptist churches. And why do Baptist churches split? Because they have a popular preacher who gets in Dutch with the church and he leaves and he takes half of them along with him. And then you have another Baptist conference or a church. They call them Bible Baptists. But that seems to be the routine almost in the Mennonites, because it appears to me that it's so much determined by how you live. As we saw when we talked about the Amish, Jacob Amish versus, who was very conservative versus the more liberal one, as they call it. And as a result, you have 2 groups of people. And they separated. The Amish, the Mennonites at one point had in Pennsylvania, had the Hook and Eye Mennonites and the Button Mennonites.
And there's the Black Bumper Mennonites.
The Black Bumper Mennonites, the Horse and Buggy Mennonites. And they were different than the Amish because they had different color buggies. The Amish were gray and the Mennonites were black.
You know, we have some really weird things in our background too, though, like the sleeping preacher. Have you ever heard of the sleeping preacher? Oh.
Yeah.
It came, I think it's a Missouri thing. He caused real rifts in the Western, because some churches kind of accepted it. He would somehow get up there and go to sleep, and then he would give God's word as he was asleep. You know, I mean, that was truly part of Harrisburg Mennonite. Kind of looked into him a bit in the 20s and 30s.
So how long would he sleep, you know?
I don't know that, and I know there's history that Zion kind of maybe had connections with him at that time, but there was more reservation at Zion than Harrisburg. So,
Well, hey, and it's not so unusual. I'll just tell you, in the Mennonite Brethren world, one day my mother asked me, I was in seminary at the time. She said, can you find out something about this preacher? He was a traveling evangelist. And I said, well, yeah, I'm at the seminary and my professor was the leader of the conference. So I went to Dr. Taves and I asked him. Yeah, he said, I know exactly who you're talking about. He was very well loved in the churches, but one day he just got a young lady involved. And he said, we as leadership of the conference just could not have him going to churches and preaching. So he disappeared. I've just started reading John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Read that one. Have any of you read it?
Have you never read it?
I have never read it.
Oh, it was assigned reading when I was in high
No,
school.
it just blows me away to listen to that traveling preacher at the beginning of the story. That was typical. It was ethics. It was theology. It was practice. And who knows why they broke out. Now let's talk about another group. And this is the Church of God in Christ Mennonite. You know about that church? Okay, and they're known as the Holdemans. Do you know who the Holdemans were? They're still here. They're still around. They're very active. John Holdeman lived in Wayne County, Ohio. And what motivated him isn't quite clear. He protested against the seemingly low level of spiritual life in the church. This concern led to intense missionary activity. The church quickly spread through the US. More members were gained by the winning of a significant number of Kleine Gemeinde members in Canada. It is estimated that over half of the Kleine Gemeinde group transferred to the Holdemans. 1989 membership was 12,694, about a quarter of them living in Canada. They're the ones who wear beards. What else can be said? The ladies wear black coverings.
But there's silver.
Oh, yeah.
I worked with her. It was a lady that was a head nurse at Willamette Falls.
Mhm.
She came here
Yeah,
in the eighties. That was.
we had a large church in Hillsborough that I was acquainted with. And my dad's younger sister, Anna, married Henry Esau. And they went to Texas, to Del Rio, Texas, southern area. And there they joined the Holdeman Church. And this is telling, something out of class, perhaps. She told me one day, she said, the biggest mistake Henry and I ever made was to join the Holdeman Church. And all of her sons and daughters were out of the church, had been thrown out by the elders because they weren't living right.
Did they leave the church?
No, they were thrown out. They were
No,
expelled.
but your sister and her husband,
Uh,
did they leave the church?
No, strangely enough, she stayed a member of the church till she died.
They have free will. They just don't have to drive back there on Sunday.
But there was all kinds of that. So we had one brother who in the church, in the Holdeman Church, who built a very nice house in Hillsborough. What nobody told anybody until it years later came out that he had put a TV antenna in the attic of his house, and he put the TV behind the cupboard. So when he wanted to watch TV, all he had to do was open the doors. And of course, in that church, television at that point was forbidden. So both it still is.
I'm sure it still is.
Well, I'm sure it is too. My cousin, Aunt Anna's son and wife were missionaries in Mexico for a period of time with the Holdeman Church. They're good people. A lot of them are hardworking people, and there's no problem that I have with them. But those two churches, or that bunch of churches, have been going fairly well. I think they're losing members now, and okay.
Spread like with the Russian, the Mennonites was Mennonites, was matter, it's kind of still ignoring.
What's that?
The Holdemans.
Oh, what happened? You're talking about the group up in the Kleine Gemeinde?
Well, no, in the United States, like, is it kind of evenly spread among, the Russians, or, because the ones I was familiar with were all like Russian, but that's probably not true everywhere.
I don't know. I know that some of the members are not Russian background, but a major part of them, I think those people did in fact join the Holdeman Church. And because German is still a strong thing in the worship and so forth. So, okay. See, just a few minutes here. Okay, let's let me do something here. I want to just tell you a little bit about the, okay. This one, is a long one. Let me just tell you. One of the things that I think you need to be aware of is the splits and division. We've just been talking about them. Okay. As I told the story, when the first South Russian immigrants came from what's now Ukraine, the major one was 1870 to 1880. They figure about 18,000 Mennonites immigrated to mostly to, let's see if I can get it right, to Manitoba, to Winnipeg, and to the area south of Winnipeg. And the other group another group came to Kansas, particularly to Hillsborough, to Mound Ridge, to Heston, to Newton, to McPherson. That's the heart of Kansas. It's heart of the wheat country. And those came, okay, so the groups of Dutch ethnic origin, the Old Colony Mennonites, if you do have any knowledge of Mennonite movements between this country, Canada, and Mexico particularly, you'll come across the word Old Colony Mennonites. Many of the Mennonites coming to Manitoba in the migrations of the 1870s were from the Chortitza colony, which was the first colony established in Ukraine. And so it was known as the Old Colony. Makes sense, doesn't it? They were joined in Canada by immigrants from the two daughter colonies of Chortitza, that is Bergtal and Furstenland. The Bergtal group settled in the East Reserve. What Canada did was south of Winnipeg to the US border was quite a bit of land area, and the Red River kind of bisects it. They reserved this big chunk of land on the east side and one on the west side. So they just called them East Reserve and West Reserve. Bergtal's groups settled on the East Reserve, south of Winnipeg. The Furstenland group settled on the West Reserve, west of the Red River, and became known as the Rhineland Mennonite Church. A decade later, many had moved from East Reserve to West Reserve. There they encountered many of the original Bergtaler settlers who adapted to the scattered patterns of living and farming. If you know something of the pattern of farming in Ukraine, you will know that they were all clustered in villages. There was reasons why we can talk about later, but many leaders saw dangers in this change, plus the added threat of the requirement of the Canadian government to have English taught in the Mennonite schools, sometimes termed as ethnic genocide by those who opposed this change in school. I've heard that phrase, ethnic genocide. Make them learn English and they'll change. The Bergtaler Church became very progressive, founding a college in Gretna, Manitoba, and forming the Conference of Mennonites in Canada. In the meantime, many old colony families had moved to Saskatchewan, settling in the Roththorn and Swift Current areas. Again, education intruded, and when it became obvious that the old colony schools would not meet the government standards, they responded by moving to Mexico in 1919. Another group moved to Paraguay. Later, another part of them moved to Belize, Bolivia, and Paraguay.